Natalie, and this is Ben. Ben is one of my grad students at Emmanuel College at the Toronto School of Theology, and we've just started collaborating around this work with my book and his art project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where my project came from, and then Ben will share a little bit with you about where his project came from, and then we're going to try to do a little bit of sort of collaborative performance as he unpacks his covers for you, and I'll be doing readings from the book. But first, just to get you oriented, so we're not throwing you in the deep end, I came to this project, Transgressive Devotion, simply as a lover of art and a theologian. And I felt like as a theologian, I had two choices for what I could do with art in my work. I could either use art to represent particular theological concepts, or I could take art as something upon which I could reflect, I could interpret and unpack it. And that seemed by and large to me to be the way that art was being used in theological discourse. But in my own life, that's not how art had operated. I did my undergraduate degree in art history and really was drawn not to Christian art, but to performance art, contemporary performance art. And it had a great role in shaping my theological imagination. Particularly even when the artwork or seemingly had nothing to do with God. And I particularly found this with art that was shocking or violent. And so what I found in those moments were that it would disrupt or rupture my theological imagination, my relationship with God, and then rearrange it into something new in a really visceral way. And so for quite some time, I've been interested in the possibilities of how art could function this way in theology, again, rather than being something that represents something or that we would interpret theologically as something that actually reshapes our theological imagination. So as I was trying to develop that in this project, I was drawing in part on Maggie Nelson's work in The Art of Cruelty, and then Maggie Nelson lovers in the room. Another artist who has so profoundly shaped my theological imagination. So Nelson talks about how typically the moral value in shocking art is seen in its power to kind of wake us up, to challenge complacency, to take what's beyond representation and bring it into representation for us. And she points out that it needs to be more than this. And so in The Art of Cruelty, she goes through multiple aesthetic theories, refusing to settle on any one of them, to try to get at all the different ways that art can operate politically, emotionally, socially, in the ways that we engage it. And so one of the strands I wanted to draw out of her book was the work she does with Rancière in that, Jacques Rancière, the philosophical, he works on philosophical aesthetics, and he's really interested in the political function of art, how art can rupture and rearrange our social imagination. So for Rancière, in line with a lot of French thinking, he understands us to live within these social systems that produce a social imaginary, and that social imaginary shapes what we can and can't perceive about reality. In fact, that social imaginary actually constructs reality for us. So it plays a primary role in our perception of reality, but it's also beyond our perception as well. It's something that we can't really encounter or articulate. It's just sort of there, sort of beneath our consciousness all the time. And Rancière believed that the political function of art wasn't to represent that broken imaginary to us, as is often thought to be the case of political art, but that it was to break that imaginary and transform it into something new, so that the process of political transformation actually happened as an act of revelation. So it actually made transformation possible and created the conditions for transformation, social transformation, rather than just show us what needed fixing. So what I wanted to think about was how you could do this with a theological imaginary, not just a social imaginary. And again, performance art had done this in my own theological imagination, had pulled apart what I understood it to mean to perform my own humanity in and with the divine. And so I wanted to take that and bring it into this sort of theological conversation in this book. So in the book, it's a sort of like a systematic theology. The chapters go Father, Spirit, Son, Church, salvation, humanity, but each one opens up with a particular performance artwork, and the artwork is not there, again, to represent the doctrine. It's not there for the doctrine to interpret it, but it's there to kind of pull the doctrine apart, rearrange it, and to make it move and dance and perform in ways that it's not used to doing. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And that's, I think, a version of what Ben is doing with his art project. So I will pass it over to him.
Hi, everyone, I'm Ben. Thanks for having me here. I want to talk about this project. It's a sort of theology and pulp sci-fi found art project, because I did a little bit of art when I was younger, but not enough to like produce this artwork on my own. So it's more collected, curated, and then I used a little bit of design to turn them into book covers. I'm going to share a PowerPoint first. So there's a truth in the world of academic theology that I think most of us recognize, but few of us actually talk about. And that's that most of our book covers are really terrible. For an area of study that I think uses a lot of creativity within our own writing, it doesn't always come out on the book covers. And the designs are often created by people who haven't read the book in question, and authors often don't have control over what the final cover looks like. And especially if the book is published as a part of a series, that can be predetermined. So here I've just I didn't want to like go after anyone, so I just created some examples of what these things might look like, sort of some of my cardinal sins of bad book covers. So this includes really bad like graphics from the 90s, stock photography, rudimentary color blocking. I have a lot like that blue book in the middle that's just words and blocks of color. Pervasive use of either mosaics, stained glass, or statues, just to give you the impression like that, oh, it's theology, it's about the church. I think there are at least 3 books in the last 20 years that have used this mosaic of Paul on the cover, so you see this one a lot. So the ones that do attempt a representation are trying to represent a theme of the book, but they're trying to do it in a way that reduces it to be marketable, to be recognizable, maybe to be eye-catching, but not necessarily to play with the theme of the book, just to like, you have 3 seconds as you're scanning over the books, so they're trying to catch your attention with that. And I've been frustrated with this for a long time. And finding myself with some spare time during this pandemic, I decided to have some fun with it. So I'm going to take us back to a time most people probably don't really want to visit, which is April of 2020. Most of us are shut in at home. Pandemic is maybe going to end in a month, by the end of the summer at the worst, right? And I've just finished my coursework. I've submitted my final papers. Natalie and I are going to do a reading course, but that's not starting for a few weeks. And so with this time on my hands, I decided to actually get into this idea of art and theology that I've been frustrated with, but never known what to do constructively. So I just let my mind wander, and I ended up actually on this Tumblr site that curates just tons of artwork from the 1960s and 70s, pulp sci-fi artwork. And I was like, well, this is an archive that I can pull from. So I've shared a few from my original series here. And the full collection, you can either find at my Twitter feed, which I've put at the bottom, or they're easier to access through the Tumblr that's at the bottom, because they're all curated in one space, and there's some broken links on Twitter, and it's just hard to navigate. But here's 4 examples. I picked Coakley, Altuis Reed, and Moltmann, particularly because they are influential in Transgressive Devotion, Natalie's book. She cites them. And then The Interior Castle is just one of my favorites that came out of this project, so I threw that one up there as well. But there are 107 covers in total. And they don't just depict a part of the book. or at least I hope they don't just depict a part of the book. I want them to play with the ideas, show something in a new way, and maybe force us to rethink something we've taken for granted. When I first posted these on Twitter, the response was often something like, this should be the new cover, or I'm printing this out and I'm putting it on my copy. They caused a reaction, first because they're entertaining. I think it is kind of a novel idea. But also some of these covers are actually doing theology themselves, I think. And like the process of doing theology, creating these covers required me to do a lot of digging, going through sources and archives and making use of material that I did not create myself. And this was often limiting. Artwork from the 60s and 70s in this sci-fi genre is overwhelmingly white. The depictions of women are usually ludicrous. And while there are those limitations there, I wanted to lean into them in the chance that it could be more generative, less representational and literal, and in a way that rearranges imagination, like Natalie was talking about. So the effect, I hope, was not just to depict that main theme or one of the themes in the book, but to restructure and represent the often familiar content of the books. In Decent Theology, this cover was actually criticized. No surprise that that's the book that gets some attention. But it got criticized on Twitter as being too straight, too heterosexual, too vanilla. Now I see an image that has bondage, kink, costumes, 3 partners, an interspecies affair. Not exactly what I would call vanilla, but it provoked a conversation about what Altuis Reid is actually trying to do in searching for the divine among people that had been labeled as indecent and practices that had been labeled indecent. In a similar way, The Crucified God by Moltmann, Moltmann wanted us to consider a God that is present in real suffering. And I think that idea has kind of lost some of its novelty over the last few decades because it's something we talk about more. It wasn't as talked about when the book came out. And so I hope that this image of this sort of terrifying and imminent God monster on this cover recovers some of that shock of what happened when people first read the book. And during the early days of the pandemic, I created a cover for Natalie's first book, Ethnographic Theology. And then when it came time for Transgressive Devotion to come out, I offered her a selection of different versions of a cover for that book that I had created. And I just was like, would you want to use one of these, when we promote the book when it comes out? And she actually selected 3 of them that she really liked. Couldn't pick just one. And so what we're going to do is go through those 3 covers one at a time, and I'm going to give some description of what was going on when I was putting the cover together, and then she's going to do a related reading from within the book. So here you have the Ethnographic Theology cover and then a corresponding cover for Transgressive Devotion. Both of these artworks are created by American sci-fi artist John Berkey. He's known especially for doing some of the first promotional work for the original Star Wars movies. This cover recalls the earlier cover in the artwork and in this bubble-like feeling. The ethnographic cover pulls ideas from Foucault, Pierre Bourdieu, Michel de Certeau, Sherry Ortner. There's field, there's the sense of the game, subfields. All of these are things that Natalie had played with in that book. And it organizes her ethnographic research in a sort of narrative way around her time at First Baptist Church in Nashville. But what Transgressive Devotion does differently is that it uses much of this ethnographic work that she did at First Baptist, but rather than giving it the through line of a narrative, she's using them ad hoc because she's doing a systematic theology and moving from doctrine to doctrine. The ethnographic notes are a central aspect of each chapter, but like in this new cover, they're scattered. So they're no longer centralized around this narrative. And the exploding ship, I think, points both to the transgression that the book is trying to perform, but also the crisis of faith, which it is a response to. And transgression is a crisis and an explosion that is a riff on what Natalie is actually doing with the performance, and it makes the text more visceral, I think. So now I'll turn it over to Natalie for her reading.
Thanks, Ben. Ben, would you stop screen sharing so I can start screen sharing, please? So in part of what Ben's saying here is every time I hear him talk about the covers, I don't just learn more about the covers, I learn more about my own work, which is part of what I thought it would be fun for us to do this together, because yeah, I hadn't thought of what he just said. It is, in a sense, what I'm trying to do, but also taking it to a new place. So I'm reading from near the beginning of the book, where I'm writing my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation, and I'm sitting with this work of art live streaming from MoMA on my computer screen to try and inspire me as I go. So this is Marina Abramovich's The Artist is Present, and I'm in a sense grappling with it to try to figure out what it is I'm doing, which it still took me another 15 years to figure out. As I sat at my computer that year, allowing Abramovich to distract and inspire me in equal measure, I was less than a year away from defending my dissertation. And unbeknownst to me in that moment, less than a year away from moving to Toronto to begin my first real academic job. I was in the midst of a number of positive life changes. I was beginning to feel as if I'd finally figured things out, as if I was making good progress on the kind of integration I still desired. But of course, I wasn't as integrated as I thought. I'd really only found one way to arrange the pieces that would work until it too didn't. And what I was failing to see in that moment was just how much ministry and academic theology had become the primary stages upon which I was performing my Christian identity, upon which I was performing my faith. I'm still not sure if it was the already years-long experience with infertility that my husband and I were experiencing at that time, or the repeated waves of my undiagnosed mental health concerns that were crashing their way towards the tsunami of full-blown mental illness. But the more I came to professionalize my Christian faith, the more that faith seemed to sever itself from who I was as a human being. Ministry and academia should provide scripts that could direct my ways in times of trouble. But as time marched on, and with no progress in sight, they mostly seemed to make things worse. And then one day I woke up and realized that I no longer believed in God. It's not that I became what is colloquially named an atheist. The concept of atheism is far too reactionary to, and therefore parasitic upon, belief in God's existence as the primary paradigm for defining a life of faith. And in the aftermath of that morning, I wasn't thinking about belief. I was thinking about hope, the most desiring of all the theological virtues. Or better, I wasn't so much thinking about hope as I was reaching towards it. I hoped that those old stories, those old doctrines, those old scriptures could still become true in some way. I yearned for the fragile conditions in which my desire for God might be illumined by the presence of hope's spirit. It's hope that endures all things as we wait, hope that shapes our yearning. What I perceived as losing my belief in God was something else entirely. It was a negation of my knowledge of God, not a negation of what I knew, but rather a negation of my knowing. It was an invitation to stop searching and instead be found. I perform these scripts of doubt and hope so often that I now hardly need to consult my lines. Internalized to my flesh, a simple gesture, a downturned gaze, a hand on my hip can set off their improvisation. Over time, they too have become the affective structures of my ways of being. I think I've arranged the pieces of myself in the right order. Then, like dry leaves, they're scattered by the wind. For a moment, I'll cohere, become transparent to myself, only to fragment to pieces again. Anything approaching authenticity appears only in the realization that I'm not the person I thought I was. It's taken multiple versions of breaking apart to get me to give up these tyrannies of order, coherence, and authenticity. I don't want to be disordered, incoherent, and fake. Almost no one does. And yet the God who I long to proclaim doesn't work with the straightforwardness I crave.
So the next cover uses artwork by Syrian artist I Am Jabber. And Jabber is a contemporary artist who uses a collaging technique to produce artwork that looks like it came out of the 1960s and 70s pulp science fiction. It's similar to a bricolage technique, something that Natalie discussed in ethnographic theology, and it was sort of the basis on which she began to shape this performative theology that comes out in ethnographic or in transgressive devotion. Disparate pieces of theological experience and insight are assembled by the theologian artist into a work of art that is recognizably Christian in the way it fits together and the image of God it portrays. But Natalie's turn to performance in transgressive devotion stops trying to assemble or describe an image of God and instead attempts a kind of theology that conjures God. The character in Rainbow doing a backflip makes this performative element explicit, as well as nodding to sources in queer theory, queer theology, and especially themes of queer temporality. The silhouette of the head contains a number of images that evoke elements of fantasy. And within transgressive devotion, fantasy can be erotic, kenotic, masochistic, God's fantasy, or ours. These are fantasies that we are invited to enter into in the hopes that God will become present. In transgressive devotion, these fantasies are not necessarily declarations of divine attributes, such as a God afflicted with Alzheimer's or the Holy Spirit as an STD. Rather, the book and I think this cover are an invitation to fantasize with them.
There we go. So an alternate creation narrative. God was so lonely in the self-sufficiency of his own autonomy that his desire created limits against which he could push. And push he did, building and intensifying his desire until it became insatiable. Recognizing the explosive value of unreleased desire, God got, quite literally, creative. Trading self-sufficiency for self-transcendence, God made himself the object of his own desire. He made himself a man. Self-projections are not always a bad thing. In fact, God called the Adam of his image good. And when this particular fantasy of self-emptying failed to come to good fruition, God's desire wasn't dampened. It was only intensified, reignited by the chase to find another way. Because as we all know, that first Adam didn't quite work out. First loves rarely do. So God made himself man after man after man, each one a different projection of his fantasy, each one performing a repetition that could consolidate or displace God's desire anew. Each man's ruin taught God a little bit more about what he actually wanted, until he became able to make himself a man once more, but this time really make himself a man. In the second Adam, God's desire for erotic ruination passed from fantasy to reality, took on flesh, and was undone. Here God got what it wanted all along, autonomy not as self-sufficiency, not even really, or at least primarily as self-transcendence, but rather fundamentally as self-negation, poured out into a completely unexpected yet terrifyingly intensified revelation of God in flesh. Pressing up against the limits of skin, sweat, and hair, the borders between creator and created were shattered in the masochistic fantasy of incarnation. Life, and then death, and as the story goes, then life once more, but not quite yet. God's body, both in the flesh and in the church, and in their brokenness and ours, the story of God's ruin keeps on being told. The eternal caught up in faulty fantasies of redemption.
For the last cover, I chose an untitled work from Jean Zarfin an illustrator ubiquitous with sci-fi novels in the 1970s, whose artwork has also been featured in Fortune magazine, Playboy, and Penthouse. I selected this painting as a depiction of Transgressive Devotion's final fantasy, Marina Abramovic and artist Josephine Decker disrobing and then embracing. The theologian is an artist in this parable, writes Natalie. And although Transgressive Devotion takes the shape of a systematic theology, it is at its core effective, and this is a part of the devotion it depicts. Natalie says that this kind of performance theology is like a prayer. And so in this performance art, the vulnerability and even indecency of the theologian or the artist allows God to appear. In this image, the artists take on an angelic appearance, and the painterly style blurs the subjects so that they begin to meld together. Are they two theologians, a pastor and a parishioner, two lovers, two artists, God and human, God and God's self? There's nudity, but the sexuality of the image really depends on what you bring from your own imagination. And the question of vulnerability and power hangs over the entire scene.
In these pages, I've tried to deploy all these theological approaches in ways that animate affect. Instead of using them to launch an argument, I've tried to perform them in ways that are vulnerable, erotic and undoing all at once, terrifying and perhaps in the end a marker of my own imbalance. My performance of faith is in many ways the misfit of any given role's constrained restraint. Such limits do not deny, but rather produce the substance of things unseen. Faith is not the rabbit pulled out from the magician's suit pocket. It's the abundant overflow of a cup that will always and almost by necessity remain too small. It's not the proverbial coin stashed between the cushions of a sofa to be unearthed. It is instead the deviant cry that erupts from script carved into flesh left uncontained. The performance of Christian faith is the slight misfire by which all other performances, and even its own performance, begin to break down. Not the gem of truth that's hidden within, but rather the subtitles of a three-penny opera, reminding you that none of this is real. Faith turned to devotion is both the sum of these pages and their remainder. The words on these pages can't pretend to be objective, but they aren't entirely subjective either. My own ad hoc context-specific ways of being a Christian in this broken world are always running circles within and around the spirit who I'm chasing. If I tried to hold them back, then each word I write in these pages would have the power to displace the word in my life. Keeping this voice present in the text, though, has been a highly tricky task, precisely because the ways that my faith transcends my academic theological commitments are kind of embarrassing to admit. Academic theology, strangely enough, leaves little room for exploring experiences we might call supernatural. But my faith is continually performed on and through many of these. They are, in fact, some of the strange moments of devotion that can't be contained within these pages, and yet towards which their transgression yearns. There's no universe, as far as I know, in which I could write in a scholarly way about the time I heard the audible voice of God, for example, the times I've been caught as collateral damage in spiritual warfare, or the spirits who visited me briefly at the borders of asleep and awake. Indeed, even now I'm tempted to write the time I thought I heard God's voice, the time I felt caught up in the battle between good and evil, the time I mistook the borders of consciousness for something else entirely. But when the light or the darkness or the silence is just right, when a nightmare continues for a split second past waking and I feel enough of a weight upon my chest, I might spend a minute praying. And not in a mindfulness way to calm myself down that I might do with an app on my phone, which has been clinically proven to have neurological and psychological benefits, but more instinctively and definitively for the protection that comes only through the blood of Christ. I've stopped my car in the middle of the street at night to dance and shake out of my fingers the energetic overflow from God's Spirit rushing through me. You can take the girl out of charismatic Christianity, but you can't take the charismatic Christianity out of the girl. Modern, rational, and decidedly less magical academic theology exiles these oddities from its canons for reflection. Still, when I traded my capacity to speak in tongues for a doctorate, I didn't quite know what I was giving up. Transgressive devotion is, among other things, my yearning in each and every direction as an attempt to get it back, or at least to find a new way to perform it. Performance understood this way reframes the negative connotation of inauthenticity to emphasize instead that we all live in the gap of our own becoming. We're not yet who Christ is calling us to be, so who we truly are is always unfolding as a curious theological experiment. We're not so much already made in God's image as we're being made into it, by it, even as we look through it at a glass dimly. I'm free to live as if I'm saved because I have died with Christ, but I won't actually live with God fully, face to face, until I've shaken off this mortal coil. My fragmentation doesn't mean I'm inauthentic. It means I'm human. And this might be the precise form of humanity from which theology needs to be written. Academic theology hasn't quite come up with the frameworks for analyzing these oddities yet. That doesn't mean they don't contribute to its production, or that it likewise doesn't contribute to theirs. In the aftermath of the day I stopped believing in God, I prayed the only prayer adequate to the task of facing the void. My God, why have you forsaken me? Echoing from the Psalms to the lips of God, God's self, and up through my throat, across my tongue to mix with the moisture hitting air, the path of my return to God had to wind its way back to the foot of the cross. The metaphor of performance disrupts the hegemony of an academic text just enough to write this theology as a broken prayer instead. A prayer that takes us into, out of, and back into unknowing once again and again and again. These pages are full of old stories, doctrines, and scriptures that have shaped the faith in my bones and that I hoped could come to feel true once again. The unwanted guests, the tongues with which I've spoken, the ecstasies unraveling that have brought me both pleasure and destruction. These are the stubborn ghosts that can't be exorcised from the theological traditions I'm performing. Each one a forgotten deja vu that's both assault and inspiration, caught up in the swoop of God's desire. I guess we didn't quite plan how this ends, so it just ended. Next time we do this, we'll come up with a better close.
Beautiful. It was a beautiful close, yeah.
Ben reminded me though that I should tell you that actually my cover doesn't suck, and I mean, at least I don't feel like it does because I designed it. And yeah, it's true that academics don't get to design their covers unless they're super pushy and super bossy, in which case you can just wear your publisher down until they give up and take it. But I had to fight for this cover for that precise reason that Ben said, because it looks way too busy and it won't attract an eye to buy it. It's focused too much on trying to interact with the text itself, rather than actually just get something that's going to make someone buy the text. But to design the cover, my spouse and I pulled every book off of our bookshelves, not off our theology ones, off our other ones, that had in some way inspired what I was trying to do in the book. And then we sort of put them all together and tried to lift out of them what were common elements of design that would connect somehow from my imagination in my literary pleasures to the pleasures of theology. And so that's how this cover came about. So I like to think it doesn't suck. Nevertheless, I still think Ben's covers are better.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Natalie and Ben. I'm sure there are comments and questions. After all of that, yeah, wow. Makes me even more excited to respond to it for the syndicate. After having this, like, you know, multimedia kind of interpretation of it, it's really fun. Yeah. You could do like special limited edition covers. I wonder if any of those are in public domain, but maybe they're not old enough, I guess.
People were saying I should sell some of them, and I'm like, I don't own this, so you can print it, but I just can't make money off of it.
Right. Well, and I think that, yeah, when it's for educational purposes too, you know. I'm, I don't know where to start. Is I
There's
guess
just a
where I am.
fullness and
Yeah.
also
I'm trying to organize my thoughts because I just appreciate, Natalie, a lot of your I suppose your methodology. So engaging both with like actual performance art and then bringing that as a lens to think about theology as a performance, and not just theology, but also religious identity. And to be writing that theology, that academic theology in a personal voice is just like not something that is often welcomed in academic study of theology. So I find all of that to be really refreshing and inspiring and feels very authentic to me. I mean, I just feel like everything that you read, I just resonated with. So that was exciting for me. And I guess I'm kind of curious, Ben, like, were you, obviously Natalie is really cool, so maybe it wasn't a problem, but like, were you nervous about it? Like, was there any point where you're like, you know, when you're interpreting, especially when you're like interpreting your advisor's work, say for example, and obviously like Natalie's already noted, like the great thing about that is that then she learns things or hears things that she didn't even think of, right? It gives you a new appreciation when others read your work for what you were trying to do, right? But I'm curious what the process was like for you as her student, engaging with the work in this way.
Yeah, it's very interesting because with most academic books, even if you know the author, you can sort of put your distance between what you're saying and your relationship with them, because you're playing with ideas that they're connected to, but there's a certain level of distance there. With Transgressive Devotion, Natalie put a lot of herself in the book, and so even just the first time I read it, I was reading it as part of our coursework together, and then to respond to it didn't just mean responding to theological ideas. I still had no idea what the book meant or was trying to do at that time. I've read it 3 times and I'm still learning what it's doing each time I read it. But there's a lot of personal stuff and a lot of stuff a doctoral student and their advisor would not normally talk about in a classroom setting there as well. And so I was very nervous about creating the covers. I wanted to do it, but there was always a feeling of like, have I crossed a line? Have I gotten too much into the personal and not into just treating the book as a book itself? Yeah, it was a really unique experience. I've made covers for a number of people that I know personally, so I had that experience before, but to do something so personal was nerve-wracking.
I'm sorry. So Ben had read a version before it went to publication, so he actually well, if any of it makes sense in the introduction around the queer historiography, that's because Ben told me it didn't make sense and I had to fix it. And he also wrote the back cover because I'm really bad at writing copy, and so he wrote that for me. And again, I was like, oh, that's what it's about, cool. But it goes both ways, because I find this when I do readings as well, you can give somebody your work, and when you work on erotic kind of theological writing, all of a sudden when you're not writing it and you're saying it to people, it's very, very stressful. Excuse me, this is not COVID, I just have heartburn. And not that you have to worry because I'm not coughing on you. But yeah, the first time Ben and I talked about the book, it was like, oh shoot, there's just so many things in here that are really embarrassing to talk about your grad student with. Like the final chapter, the artwork he saw of the woman lying down masturbating in front of an electrical digger. That's from an artwork by called Oil Pressure Vibrator by Kim Hyung Yo, a South Korean artist. And That was we had a hard time talking about that chapter. Yeah, so be that a caution to you if you want to write transgressive stuff.
But I think it's so important because so many, you speak to these experiences that are increasingly in our modern landscape and culture of these oddities becoming kind of taboo. And I mean, I love what Maggie Nelson writes about taboo. First of all, is where my mind goes. And I love like what you're bringing some of that work into theology, but it's so important because that's where it still occurs. Our theological construction and deconstruction and forming our identities. They don't like happen in church services or in public a lot of times. They happen in these like erotic encounters or encounters with art. So I just want to that's just something that I'm sitting with right now. It's like how refreshing it is to make theology intimate and to invite consideration of that. And model this theological dialogue that might make approaching some of those things like more accessible isn't the word that I want. But if you're communicating with images, like, oh, I'm creating this text or this reflection or this piece of art, and then someone creates something in response to that, and not even talking about it a lot. Like there's just like there's an emergent quality, and there's like all of this new surface area to interact with, I guess, that wouldn't have occurred in the limits of one person's imagination, and also allows for like us to maybe touch or like talk about things that are hard to just talk about cold on your own. It depersonalizes it a little bit, I guess. But I'm curious about that collaboration and whether you've presented before or whether this is like where you've seen this modeled other places, like
On my screen, I put my hand out to Ben, but I could have been putting it out to anyone. Take it away, John.
What we did today is sort of like an expanded version of 2/3 of what we did at the book launch for her book, and that involved 3 scholars responding after our part, and so that part obviously is missing. But so that was sort of what we were playing with, especially that performance art piece, because the book launch was not recorded, and at first the consideration was just like, can we actually post this artwork like through the school's accounts? Is that illegal? But as we got into it, I think Natalie was saying like, no, I think it should be like a performance art, and if you miss it, you miss it, and you had to be there for it. And so we had kind of leaned into that. But the feeling of a performance art is something that goes through the text as well. And a lot of books do this, but I think Transgressive Devotion makes it explicit, or it feels explicit, that I'll say this as someone who's read it 3 times, like you never read it the same way twice, and it's never the same book twice. And so you can't repeat a performance the exact same way, and you're not going to repeat the reading the same way. And I think that's jarring. If you come to the text, it is a systematic theology, but if you come to it expecting a systematic theology like we usually know it, you're gonna trip up pretty quick. I think there was a reviewer of the book who came to it looking for a systematic theology, and she didn't dismiss the book, but she was saying like, this is not systematic theology as we know it.
That if you're looking for a rational argument, don't go to this book. But if you're looking to dance through Natalie Wigg-Stevenson's theological fantasies or something like that, do. And I was like, that's what I was going for. Yeah, not an insult. Yeah, very good.
So that performative genre comes through even in the process of reading the book.
but it's all, when we were trying to figure out how to do the launch, I often find book launches a little bit boring. And you go because you love the person. But it was like thinking about these found object artworks that Ben had created that drove the whole thing. And at some point in the planning, I was like, is this a lot of pressure on you? Because we have now created this whole event around his book covers and then these readings and then scholars from all over the place coming and responding, and the whole thing was flowing out of Ben's work. And it was because I don't think we see stuff like this. I don't think we see and I feel like this is okay for me to say because it's not the thing that I did, it's the thing that Ben did. Like, we don't really see this sort of art text performative interaction. And so it's kind of, so this is the first time with you guys that we're kind of taking the show on the road and seeing what we can do with it, because it feels like there's something more interesting than just transgressive devotion going on here. And we haven't figured out what it is yet, but I really would like to, because that dialogue between these two, I like to think mine's an art form, but Ben's actually is. So these dialogue between these two works of art I think has something really generative potentially could happen out of it. And again, like, I think to your question, Stephanie, I don't think we do see this. So I'm really grateful to Ben.
You think of even like in our classes, I've often thought, we have these, everyone has their own like little exposition. I am doing my own final constructive project, but what it would look like to do projects that are in conversation with each other, like even on the learning level of things. We do that for presentations sometimes.
I think I've had only one case where students collaborated. Elizabeth, did you? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of add, kind of maybe even jumping off something that you had asked them earlier, but I'm just curious for both of you, Ben and Natalie, and I'm going to call you both artist theologians, artist theologian writers. I'm curious, and it doesn't have to be just this collaboration, it could be anything that's come before, what you might have learned from each other in the collaboration, kind of like a reflecting mirrors back to each other on your own work, your own theology, and even your own faith, if you want to dig into the personal aspect of it too, and how what you might have learned, what might have changed, or how that reflection to each other helped you see something about yourself or something different. You can answer that however you want.
And I
kind
feel
of a
like
loaded question.
You're laughing because you know what I have to say, right? Ben, what did I learn from you?
Well, this is also a loaded question for me because it's literally, what did you learn from your doctoral supervisor?
You have to have an answer. Is it what Bourdieu's habitus is?
Right.
Not
I
yet.
hope by now I've learned what Bourdieu's habitus is, but I'm not confident that I have. But there did come a point, I don't remember which paper I was writing, but we noted how much I started to sound like Natalie and what to do about that. And there was a point where I said, right now, I think I'm okay with it because I'm learning to use these new terms and ideas. And I don't know that I'm ready to use them on my own yet. And so I was fine with really going deep into what she was doing and making it a part of my process. And now that I'm just starting to write a dissertation, I'm figuring out which parts of it I'm going to use and how I'm going to make use of it, rather than just being the student that is a parrot of their supervisor. Yeah,
Ben had handed in a paper and I was like, oh no, this does sound, I've done that thing that terrible advisors do. And so, yeah, we talked about it and now we can really hear. But I think that question of voice really relates to the work we're trying to do here of, what is a theological voice? We talk about the self being in theology, but not so much from the perspective of the voice of the theologian. And so part of, I think what we're trying to do here is sort of tease out whose voice is whose and figure out that piece in a dialogical way. I was laughing, Ben, because you forced me to admit that I was a post-liberal one day, and I was shocked and appalled. But at some point I had to admit that there were post-liberal tendencies in some of my work. Yeah, there's something else you taught me, but now it's escaping me because I'm just thinking about this horrible post-liberal thing.
That's okay. Thank you for speaking to that. So yeah, thanks for answering. Just curious, given the nature of collaboration, and I might counteract that with, did you discover something like a beautiful third voice between the two of you?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to
Kind of
say.
the problem with collaboration. There's like good things and difficult influences. So I was just curious about that too.
Well, I think with collaboration, when I was thinking about this, when Stephanie was talking to, you can come together and start from scratch together. But when you have a power dynamic, like the one that a supervisor has with their student, that's really dangerous. Like Ben said, we have moments where he kind of speaks in my voice and we have to think through that carefully. But we both came to the table with our own projects and then made the projects talk to each other. And that's where I think the possibility lies, right? His covers came out of taking something he was already doing with covers and talking with the book. And then, these weren't necessarily the readings I would typically do. These were the readings I chose specifically for the covers he gave me. So we were both there with our own projects, and it's those that were talking to each other, I think, for the collaboration, which doesn't do away with the power dynamics. I mean, I feel like we're going to have a conversation about this presentation afterwards about power dynamics. Yeah, so, but that's how I feel about it. I don't know, Ben, how do you, we're co-presenters right now, so you can just say.
Right now.
Yeah, right now. You have 10 minutes, go.
Until the recording ends. No. And especially since power dynamics and the fluidity of power have been part of the focus of what we studied together, it becomes even more on the surface of what we're doing.
We're coming up on time, but are there any other comments, questions?
Oh yeah, we're over.
Kind of our flexible start time, a flexible end time, so it's our way.
I have two questions. What's being sorted on the table here? Are you doing like a and John, what is the sketch or the image behind you there?
Oh, John, go first.
Which one, the green one or the brown one?
No, the brown one.
Oh, the brown, it's the Last Supper by, it's a woodcut
It's beautiful.
by Sister Mary Charles. She's a Benedictine. She's deceased now.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
John has amazing artwork.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a reference to the Bianca portrait. I meant your other collection.
Jennifer's on my wall.
I just
Jennifer.
realized that. I realized that as I said it, and then thought I or walk that back. I did a portrait of John's dog, Bianca. Here, the project is, give a closer view. This is a collaborative kind of sculptural community arts project that we started. We had a symposium week a few weeks ago. It was in October, wasn't it? Oh my God. Yeah.
Early November.
It was early November. Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah.
It was early November, so it was just a few weeks ago. And so we're working with one of our esteemed alum, Cheryl Schweihart, who's a textile artist, and brought in a bunch of textiles that she herself had dyed using a transfer. It's like a heat transfer method. That's really cool. And so we have this big chicken wire formation that we're like weaving fabric scraps through. We don't really know what it will be yet, but it's in process. So now that symposium week is over, when people pop in, you can just like mess around with it. And then when it feels done, we'll do something with it.
That's so cool. Will you send us a picture when it's done?
For sure. Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, I want to be, mindful of everybody's time. We have class starting in about 30 minutes here. So thank you so much for
Thank
sharing
you.
this, Natalie and Ben. It's really
Yeah,
fun.
thank you.
I'm so excited for this work. And I also think that it's a great model of collaboration too. So I look forward to, still being in conversation with you.
Great.
Going forward. So I'm sure we'll have more.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.